Good afternoon. My name is Jana Gordon, and as Executive Director of Alumni and Development and of the King's University College Foundation, I have the great privilege of welcoming you to the 2020 Christopher Perrin Beatty Lecture and Celebration of Student Awards. This year's event is, as you are aware, different than in past years. Usually, the Christopher Perrin Beatty Lecture and the Student Awards Ceremony are two separate events, occurring on the same or consecutive days, but because we are not able to gather in person, we have had to adapt this year. Today, we are celebrating students who are scholars, leaders, and an inspiration to the King's faculty and staff who are privileged to work and learn alongside them. Thus, even though we won't be able to bring together these exceptional students and our valued donors, we recognize that this is an important moment for reflection and celebration. And the first part of our afternoon will be spent celebrating our Student Award recipients. We will follow this with the presentation of the Christopher Perrin Beatty Lecture in recognition of King's outstanding teaching faculty. This annual lecture was established by family and friends of the late Christopher Beatty, and we are so pleased that the Beatty family is here with us today. Before we move into the more formal part of our event, let us begin by acknowledging that our campus is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehook, and Attawandaron peoples, all of whom have long-standing relationships to the land of southwestern Ontario and the City of London. The First Nations communities of our local area include the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation. And in our region, there are 11 First Nations communities, as well as a growing Indigenous urban population. King's University College values the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and all of the original peoples of Turtle Island. In respectful acknowledgement of our Indigenous neighbors, and on behalf of the entire King's community, which includes many Indigenous students and a growing number of distinguished Indigenous faculty and trustees, I offer you the warmest of welcomes, a King's welcome. Now, I would like to ask our principal, Dr. David Malloy, to come to the podium. Dave?
Thank you, Jana. Welcome everyone to the Student Awards Ceremony and to the Beatty Lecture. You'll of course be hearing more about these fantastic students that have won awards, but I'd really like to pause for a moment and thank family and friends of all of these students. I'd also like to thank faculty and staff at King's University College, because without all of you, these students wouldn't be thriving as much as they are in our community. So thank you all to those who support each and every one of these individual award winners. I'd also like to thank the donors. So going to university is tough enough, but when some students have some financial challenges, it makes it extremely, extremely difficult. And whether these are very large awards or whether very small ones, they could make the difference between a parent paying a babysitter in order for them to come to class or to attend class at all. So every little bit, every penny, every dollar that you give to King's to help our students is extremely impactful. And I want to thank you very, very much for all that you do for King's. I'd also like to thank the Beatty family for your constant support with this lecture. And Perrin, for your support for King's in general. It's really appreciated, and we're better because of your wonderful support. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our Associate Dean Academic and the Chair of the Scholarship and Bursaries Committee, Dr. Laura Melnick-Gribble. Thank you.
Thank you, Principal Malloy. It is an absolute delight to be here to celebrate the many accomplishments of our students. The scholarships and bursaries awarded today recognize our students' academic achievements, their dedication to service, often stunning perseverance, their grit, their ability to overcome obstacles, and their active engagement here at King's, in London, and abroad. Today's event also celebrates our donors' hope, joy, and optimism. Many of these awards give us pause to honor the memory of treasured loved ones. All of these awards encourage our students to strive for excellence, and all of these awards recognize the promise of King students to make a difference and to build community. The scale of our donor support is truly remarkable. With their generosity, King's has awarded over $2 million in financial aid in the last year. I offer my deepest gratitude to each donor for your commitment to our students. Thank you. The Scholarship and Bursaries Committee received over 1,850 applications this fall. Reading these applications was simply inspiring. We are indeed blessed to have so many amazing students. My warmest congratulations to all of today's award recipients. It's my great pleasure now to welcome Mari Pullman to the podium. Mari is a fourth-year student in our honors specialization program in psychology and minoring in criminology. Mari is the inaugural recipient of the Emil Petruski Memorial Award. Mari?
Thank you, Dr. Melnick. As Dr. Melnick mentioned, my name is Mari Pullman, and I'm in my fourth year of a dual degree in psychology and criminology. I'd like to begin by saying congratulations to all of the other award recipients on your accomplishments and hard work. It's been quite the year, and I know at least for me that this scholarship really helps to take some of that load off. This award was created in memory of Emil Petruski, who was a classmate of mine throughout high school and university. I regret that I only got to know him well during the last couple of years of his life, but I'm very grateful for that time. Emil and I shared a passion for forensic psychology, and I only wish we would have been able to graduate and venture into that path together. I've applied to graduate schools, and come next fall, I hope to be able to work towards helping those same vulnerable individuals that Emil intended to aid. I would like to thank Emil's parents and his family and friends, as well as the rest of the King's community for this generous donation. And on behalf of the other award recipients, thank you again to the King's community and additional donors for their continued support.
I love the community at King's and how we help each other grow as individuals. The financial support I received from awards allows me to dedicate time to my role as head residence assistant and help first-year students make a smooth transition into university.
Because of the financial support I've received from student awards, I'm able to volunteer in the community, and I've gone on experiential learning trips. These opportunities have allowed me to learn about people and cultures from around the world, and have also helped me contribute my voice to social justice issues.
The scholarships and awards that students receive provide opportunities for us to devote time to our passions. They have allowed me to focus on my classes instead of working 1 or 2 jobs just to cover my expenses. Your support has helped change my life. For that, and all you do for King students, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I just want to say I am so grateful for everything you do for myself and other King students.
I'm so grateful.
Thank you for your continuous support for the King's community.
Thank you to Mari Pullman for your remarks, and to Jill Giovanni, Victoria Goldsack, and Broderick Curry for sharing your thoughts on video. The full listing of student award recipients and the videos will be available on our website. As the Executive Director of King's University College Foundation, I would like to again thank our wonderful and generous donors. The foundation is responsible for encouraging and stewarding philanthropic gifts to support the priorities of the college, including scholarships and awards, innovative programming, exceptional faculty and research, and campus facilities. We are grateful to you who support student financial awards, and congratulations again to all the exceptional students who are celebrated here today. Now, I would like to call our Vice Principal and Academic Dean, Dr. Jillian Balfour, to the podium.
Good afternoon. First established in 1995 academic year, the King's Excellence in Teaching Award is based on evidence of continued contributions to the academic development of students, inspiring them to do more in the world with the knowledge and confidence that they've acquired. Teaching is both an art and a science. Faculty who are nominated for this award are recognized already amongst their colleagues as role models for their dedication to student learning, as shown through their creativity, innovative teaching materials and methods, and how they care for and inspire their students. We are pleased that the recipients of the 2020 Teaching Awards are Dr. Graham Broad, Associate Professor in History, and Dr. Vidya Nadaranjan, our Writing Program Coordinator and Assistant Professor in our Writing French and English program. I would like to call on Patrick Beatty to speak about the establishment of the award honoring the faculty recipients and to introduce today's speakers. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jillian, and thank you to King's for putting together today's event. I want to start off quickly by recognizing my mother, Julia, and my father, Perrin, who are watching from Ottawa today. I spoke to them on the phone last night, and I know they regret as much as I do that the circumstances are not different and that we can all be there in person today. That being said, it's a particular pleasure for me to be able to participate in this year's Christopher Perrin Beatty Lecture. This is the first time I've been able to participate since the lecture series started in 2012, because I was previously living on the other side of the country in Calgary. For those of you who don't know, this lecture was established after my brother Christopher died from a motorcycle accident in Thailand in 2008. He was only 23 years old at the time. He had graduated from King's a year earlier, and his time at the school was a great source of pride for him. He loved every minute he spent at King's, and our family had the opportunity to see him grow as a young man through his experiences at the school. I was surprised to learn that one of the professors being honored today even taught Christopher in 2 courses while he was at King's. If I'm being honest, I was a little skeptical at first that a professor would remember teaching Christopher some 13 years later, but he remarked that he remembered Christopher to be quite opinionated. Professor Broad, I now have no doubt that you in fact taught my brother. It's true, Christopher was very opinionated. He loved history and politics, and he loved to debate. He would debate anyone about anything, always for sport and never out of malice, but always to win. But he was also versatile. I remember one debate we had when he was at university. The topic isn't important, but suffice to say, I wasn't winning the argument. I remember he grinned to me and he said, "Patrick, if you want, I can switch sides with you and I'll still win." I thought this was impossible. How could he argue my side of the debate after he had so forcefully argued his? What he said to me stayed with me forever. He said, if you can't argue both sides of a debate, then you really don't understand the issue. In this age of hyperpartisanship, where it's easy to write off opponents as enemies, I often think back to what Christopher said. What would the world be like if we all understood the other side a little better? And that's what great professors do every day, help us understand our world a little better, which is why I know Christopher would have been so pleased with what we're doing here today, honoring outstanding professors and learning from them. Professors dedicate their lives to becoming experts in their field of study and sharing their expertise with their students. Great professors make complex subjects accessible, make even the driest of topics captivating. They teach us how to think critically about the world. They teach us how to organize our thoughts, and they teach us how to communicate those thoughts with others. I know we can all think back to great professors we've learned from that have made a difference in our lives. While we may not remember everything they taught us, we will always remember the effect they had on us. That's why it's my great honor to introduce our co-recipients of the King's Awards of Excellence in Teaching, Dr. Graham Broad and Dr. Vidya Natarajan. From the comments I've seen from their students, they both embody the best of what it means to be a professor. Our first honoree, Dr. Broad, is Associate Professor of History at King's University College. He is the author of 3 books, 2 of them concerning Canada and the World Wars, the most recent of which is 1 in 1,000, The Life and Death of Captain Eddie McKay, Royal Flying Corps. It was a biography of a Western student who served in the First World War, and also a reflection on historical theory and method. He's also a guide with the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, which takes Canadian students to First and Second World War battlefields in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and is the co-director of Wartime Canada, the internet's largest repository of wartime ephemera. His lecture is titled History, Memory, and Reconciliation on the Battlefield. Our other honoree, Dr. Natarajan, has been a professor of English literature and writing at King's University College since 2004, and coordinator of the writing program at King's University College since 2017. She oversees tutoring at the Right Place and coordinates the delivery of writing courses. Over the last 3 years, Dr. Natarajan has redesigned and taught first-year writing courses, recently creating and teaching Writing 2301F, Tutoring Writers, and Writing 2208G, Teaching Writing, both of which can be used towards the new Certificate in Teaching and Practice of Writing. Her lecture is titled Academic Writing and Linguistic Justice. Professors, thank you for everything you do for your students. I can't wait to listen to the lectures you prepared for us today. Professor Broad, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a great privilege to be able to give this talk in honor of Chris, who was a student of mine in 2006, 2007, and also to share the honor today with my colleague, Dr. Natarajan. The teaching award I was a recipient of today speaks of innovation in the classroom, but actually my approach to teaching is really rather straightforward. I believe in asking students big questions about complex problems. I believe in solitary reading. I believe in the importance of well-designed lectures as a form of active learning. But having said all that, I'm also a big believer in getting students outside of the classroom to engage in purposeful ways in the field. Why go beyond the classroom with students? Why go places? Why travel? I think it's because there's a power of place, because there's a world of difference between being physically present somewhere as opposed to encountering it secondhand or just in a photograph, as we've all been reminded very acutely during these months of lockdown. There are opportunities to be more fully present in the past at historic sites than we can achieve in the classroom itself, such as here at the coastal French town of Puy near Dieppe, where an entire Canadian regiment was destroyed in August of 1942. And standing there, you can immediately appreciate the enormity of the problem that was faced by the attacking forces. In addition, being in the field gives us opportunities for all kinds of cross-cultural and intergenerational encounters, such as these two that happened in a 2014 trip that I made to France with students, quite by accident. On the left, Madame Vico is the assistant caretaker of the Abbaye d'Ardenne, where Canadians were executed, murdered actually, by members of the SS. She told us in great detail the story of the recovery of their remains and what it has meant to her over the years to meet Canadians coming to that particular site. The gentleman on the right approached us in a small town called Bouron, to describe what it was like for him as a young boy in France to live under Nazi occupation. I've taken my students a lot of places. What I want to talk to you about today for only about 15 minutes is the study tours that I've led to First and Second World War battlefields and sites of commemoration in Europe and a few of the conclusions I've reached about what impact that can potentially have on students. But I want to begin with just a little bit of background today. The First World War, which was the most destructive war in history up to that point, was followed in many countries by an enormous commemorative effort to commemorate all of the war dead. This was very different from earlier European wars. You can go from one side of Europe to the other and count on your fingers the number of graves for rank and file soldiers of the Napoleonic Wars, for example. High-ranking officers would receive tremendous honors, but ordinary rank and file soldiers tended to be buried in mass graves. By contrast, the First World War in Europe was followed by an entirely different movement, a vast commemorative movement with a far more democratic impulse. And as a result of this, literally thousands of military cemeteries and memorials dot the landscape of former battlefields in the two world wars, where countries that could sought to commemorate all of the fallen as individuals. And today, briefly, I want to consider the specific case of the British Empire, which of course included Canada and later as part of the Commonwealth. During the First World War, the British government created an organization called the Imperial War Graves Commission, which still exists as the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And its job was to bury the dead of the world wars and to find suitable ways of commemorating the missing. The commission carried out its work in both the First and Second World War, and it now maintains 1.7 million graves to the British Empire's war dead, or names on memorials to the missing in 151 countries. Here in London, Ontario, there are 250 war graves, for example. Now, the vast majority of these, of course, are on former battlefields in Western Europe, and in particular, Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, where there are more than 1,500 military cemeteries, some of them as small as a dozen graves, some, such as this one at Tyncott, Belgium, with over 10,000. Now, the commission had a number of governing principles. The first one was that everyone who fell should be commemorated and that they would be commemorated equally. It was a remarkably egalitarian impulse on the surface. Regardless of rank or social station, everyone would receive the same gravestone. And they look like this. Now, bottom right, what you're looking at is the memorial for the great British Admiral Nelson from the Napoleonic Wars, which is in St. Paul's Cathedral. This wouldn't happen in the First World War. Wealthy elites wouldn't be permitted to build bigger memorials than what anybody else got. There was a sense of equality of sacrifice. The second governing principle was that the dead would not be repatriated, which is to say, they would be buried near where they fell alongside their comrades. The cemeteries themselves would be their memorials and a kind of map of the battlefield for future generations to experience. This meant a permanent separation of families from their fallen loved ones overseas. And this in turn explains why the local cenotaph became so very important throughout the British Empire and then Commonwealth, such as this cenotaph in London, Ontario, which, by the way, is an exact copy, it's actually a 2/3 scale copy of the Whitehall cenotaph in London, England. The local cenotaph became a surrogate grave, and the annual Remembrance Day ceremonies became a surrogate funeral for families who were separated forever from their loved ones. I think it's very difficult for us to imagine today how widespread was the sense of mourning in Canada after the two world wars. There was, of course, a celebration of victory, but 110,000 Canadians had been killed or died at a time when the population was less than a third of what it is today. The country was, for a generation, in a perpetual state of mourning. The purpose of commemoration is to provide us with consolation. Hence the reason why nearly every church or school or civic building that's old enough has a roll of honor in Canada and elsewhere throughout the British Commonwealth. Why nearly every town in the country has a cenotaph around which annual Remembrance Day services continue to be held, even decades after the wars ended, even through COVID very recently. And very little about these ceremonies has changed over time. They still seem funereal in their approach to commemoration. Someone who moved through time from 1920 to 2020 would recognize everything that occurred at a Remembrance Day service. Commemoration serves emotional needs for us. It serves social needs to mourn collectively and to console ourselves that the fallen died for some higher purpose. But here's the problem, because I'm a historian. Commemoration is an emotive process. History is a critical process. And so when we take students overseas, part of the job is to look at the limits of commemoration and instead to critically engage with the past and to put some distance between ourselves and emotion. In theory, the fact that we're Canadians doing Canadian history, for example, should be incidental. We may not always like what we discover about the past, but there's nothing that we can do about it. For example, students in CWGC cemeteries overseas will invariably have to wrestle with the disjuncture between the commemorations that they're familiar with at home, which again are emotive, often highly nationalistic, in which the wars are described as straightforwardly as struggles for human freedom, and the reality of British imperialism, with the fact that, as the cemeteries overseas attest, many thousands, indeed tens of thousands of those who died for Britain were members of groups that had been subjugated by the empire. And that in turn encourages students to reflect upon the fact that the global nature of the world wars was not just that they were fought all over the world, but that people traveled all over the world to fight in them. And they did so for a variety of reasons. Some because they believed in the justice of the cause, some for adventure, some for employment, others in the hope of earning a fuller claim to citizenship. This was especially important for the various subject peoples that they represented. Others because they were conscripted and compelled to fight. There should be no mistaking that despite its egalitarian veneer, the War Graves Commission was and remains an imperialist project. It was led by advocates of imperial unity for whom Britain and empire were the inheritors of a tradition that they felt extended back to classical antiquity. And that's why all their cemeteries and memorials look like Greek or Roman monuments, such as this one, the Menin Gate Memorial to the Missing, which was designed quite self-consciously to look like a Roman temple. Or in the case of Tyncott Cemetery here, notice how the dead are arrayed as if in an army in the ancient world, in phalanxes, all of them facing what appears to be a giant amphitheater, and the amphitheater centered around the Christian cross. Incidentally, I mentioned before that these cemeteries, they buried the dead as near to where they fell as possible. This is literally true. The cross that you see in the center there is literally built on top of a German bunker. So the dead were buried right on the German lines where they fell. So there were other motives for the Imperial War Graves Commission besides commemoration, and these are ones that as students of history overseas, we confront firsthand when exploring the limits of commemoration. Another example would be a visit such as this one to the Indian Memorial at Neuve-Chapelle, France, where 4,700 soldiers of India are buried. This is very sobering because generally speaking, Canadian students don't know anything about India or its history. And this prompts them to ask about the absence of 1.7 million Indian soldiers who served in the First World War, of 2.4 million who served in the Second World War, and who are largely excluded from the familiar narratives of the war. And it prompts students to ask why. It also serves to remind students that the history of the world wars is seen very differently in other parts of the world than it is seen here in Canada, and indeed seen very differently in different parts of Canada than here in southwestern Ontario, the way we typically see it. Because these parts of the world had a different colonial relationship with Britain than did British Canada. And I would add that our conventional narratives of the war will be subjected to strain as the demography of our country changes over the coming generations. Now, this isn't to suggest that students come away from all this concluding that the two sides in the war were morally equivalent. That's not our goal. Our goal here is to confront firsthand the limits of commemoration as a means of understanding the past. While in cemeteries overseas, or indeed at some local war graves, there are about 250 war graves here in London, Ontario, mainly for people who died in accidents or natural causes on the home front. Students are encouraged to give biographical presentations at war graves. And I encourage the students to do so as historians, to try to put some critical distance between themselves and their subjects. And in so doing, I found that the students come to see the soldiers, the fallen, not just as abstractions of political ideals, but as real people such as themselves, often people not much older than themselves, people who had to make terrible choices at a terrible time in history, such as this French-Canadian conscript of the First World War, being commemorated here, by the way, by Sana, who was his great niece. I mentioned before how historians have to distance themselves from the subject of study, but the visits to cemeteries, battlefields, and other memorials often brings home in very emotional ways the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe of the war, such as in this inscription at the base of one CWGC memorial. He was only one of the many, but he was ours. Another thing that surprises a lot of Canadians traveling to foreign battlefields is the fact that life goes on in France since the Second World War, or Belgium, or the Netherlands. For example, the site of sunbathers on Juno Beach, where Canadians landed on D-Day, leaves a lot of Canadian visitors outraged. For many Canadians, this is hallowed ground. This is a place where Canadians died to sanctify this ground in pursuit of a just cause, the defeat of fascism in Europe. But for French locals and other tourists, it's just the beach. And the fighting that occurred there is something that went on for about 3 hours on a single day, 3/4 of a century ago, in that very, very long history of the beach. So this realization that the past and how we respond to it has many possible and contested meanings can help nurture thinking about ethics, and it can generate sympathy by promoting cross-cultural exchanges, sometimes in surprising ways. Finally, some of the most meaningful and transformative experiences I've had with students overseas comes when we visited military cemeteries of former adversaries, such as this one, the German War Cemetery at Langemarck, which is in West Flanders of Belgium. 44,000 German soldiers of the First World War are buried here on foreign soil, because after the First World War, the Belgian government agreed to allow them to be buried there as an act of reconciliation with the Germans, despite 95% of Belgium having been occupied by Germany during the First World War. And Langemarck has gone on to serve as an important site of symbolic reconciliation between former enemies. There are annual ceremonies here involving representatives of German, Belgium, French, and UK governments, and school children from the 4 countries tend to the graves there as part of class projects. Particularly moving for university students who visit Langemarck is the chapel dedicated to 3,000 German university students who were killed in the First Battle of Ypres in 1914. Their names inscribed in the chapel there. Now, admittedly, these goals of using German military cemeteries as sites of reconciliation has proven much more difficult to accomplish for the Second World War than the First, because in the case of the Second World War, the criminality of the Nazi state is undeniable, and those wounds still remain very raw and in the scope of living memory. Probably the most challenging experience I've ever had as a teacher, in fact, I'd go so far as to say I bungled it, came the first time I visited the colossal German military cemetery at Le Combe, which is near Bayeux in Normandy. 21,000 German soldiers of the Second World War are buried here. A significant portion of them members of the Waffen-SS. So the Waffen-SS was the military arm of the Nazi political organization that was chiefly responsible for the Holocaust. Among those buried here are perpetrators of the horrific massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane, where an entire French village was annihilated in the days after D-Day. And visiting here, I encountered a broad range of responses from students. Some were of the opinion that we shouldn't go to a Nazi cemetery at all, that going to a cemetery implies reverence for the dead, and since we can't feel that way about Nazis, we ought not to enter the cemetery. This is a position with which I have wrestled myself. Others were of the opinion that every human is made in the image of God and deserves a modicum of respect. Still others transposed the sentiment of Canadian Remembrance Day onto the fallen in this cemetery, arguing that anyone who served their country in uniform deserves respect for their sacrifice. Others objected to that, saying that surely the question isn't just military service, but military service in pursuit of a just cause. And Nazism, of course, having been objectively evil, the service requires no reverence. Others asked, well, what about soldiers on the Allied side who may have committed war crimes, bombing of civilians, for example, or about the complicity of Britons, Americans, Canadians, Belgians as colonizers in crimes against humanity? Still others wondered if, as historians, we should be asking moral questions about the past at all, or simply trying to understand it. Well, I couldn't answer any of these queries because I don't have the answers myself. But that spirit of inquiry, I believe, a willingness to listen to one another carefully, I think is the first step in developing an empathic approach to the study of history. That spirit of inquiry I saw here from students was one that was exemplified by Chris Beatty. Chris, he never went overseas with me, but as his brother was saying earlier, Chris loved to argue and discuss and debate. He was always reading. It was just rarely what was assigned for class. But I like that about him. I like that about him because at the core of my teaching philosophy is a belief that what we cover in class is less important than what we discover together. Earlier in this talk, I stated that the purpose of commemoration is to provide consolation, and I sincerely hope that this series, named in Chris's honor, has performed that purpose for his family and friends. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I have had the good luck to be a learner in lifelong conversation with other learners, caught up every year in the currents of curiosity, scholarship, idealism, and passionate social engagement that flow wherever students are. On this day that celebrates student achievement, I send heartfelt congratulations to the King's Award winners. It is a special kind of privilege to be speaking on this occasion, something that I, as a part-time teaching awardee, would not have done, but for Dr. Graham Broad's generous insistence on sharing this platform, and the Beatty family's warm acceptance of a deviation from past practice as we honor Christopher's memory. My thanks to all of them. My theme today, drawing on my area of current research, is academic writing and linguistic justice. I'm going to begin with a story. In a course in 20th century children's literature I taught some years ago, I had included a young adult novel called A Hero Ain't Nothin' But a Sandwich by Alice Childress. The novel was written as a series of dramatic monologues spoken by multiple characters, many of them members of a struggling yet resilient African-American family. Quilting the central story from accounts by different narrators was a formal choice that made complete sense for an author who was an acclaimed actress, a playwright, and a luminary in Harlem Renaissance theatrical circles. After my class had read the novel, I asked them what they thought of the author's technique. Hands shot up all around the class. I asked them what they were going to say, hoping that I would get excited comments on the text's sheer experimental chutzpah, its exquisitely differentiated and authentic voices, the burning rawness of the narrative, or perhaps the dialogic emergence of the story from different perspectives. I was disconcerted by what student after student came up with. The novel was hard to read. Narrators spoke poor or bad English, and the only readable chapters were the ones narrated in quote unquote correct English by the two white characters. These students had reached year 3 or 4 of university without knowing that linguists consider Black English vernacular as rich, rule-governed, and complete a code as standard English, and that literary critics consider the use of dialect to be a deliberate, technically challenging, and expressive heightening of narrative. At work in these students' reading of this brilliant text was the normalization of white linguistic expression and the routine devaluation of all things Black, including Black modes of self-expression. Such devaluation had no doubt been part of the students' experience from kindergarten upwards, and perhaps was also replicated in most students' home settings. So they were not to blame. I set about explaining that Black vernacular was infinitely more than a degraded version of white middle-class English. I quoted Toni Morrison. She says, "It is terrible to think that a child with 5 different present tenses comes to school to be faced with books that are less than his own language. And then to be told things about language, about his language, which is him, that are sometimes permanently damaging. That is a really cruel fallout with racism." As the discussion continued, I thought about how some of the more academically ambitious among the students in that class were only 2 or 3 years away from becoming graduate teaching assistants or high school teachers, Radamanthine judges and graders of student writing. What were the implications of their ignorance, their eyes-deep immersion in what critical race theorists call standard language ideology, for the success of the Black and multilingual students they would teach in the future? The ignorance of the students in my class was not accidental. It was the natural consequence of an education system that centers white language, white history, and white power, and suppresses the long history of violence on Black bodies and minds, including the enforcing of illiteracy on pain of death, as well as the history of Black resistance through linguistic and cultural means, all of which had significant effects on Black use of the language of the enslaver. Far from there being penalties for such ignorance, professing it is socially and professionally acceptable or even beneficial. As the philosopher Charles Mills observes, what he terms the racial contract, I quote, prescribes for its signatories an inverted epistemology, an epistemology of ignorance, a particular pattern of localized and global cognitive dysfunctions which are psychologically and socially functional, producing the ironic outcome that whites will, in general, be unable to understand the world they themselves had made, unquote. The penalties of the ignorance of white educators are paid in large measure by Black students. The very professors of English who would sing the praises of a novel by James Joyce or Roddy Doyle or even Alice Walker, written in dialect, will denounce the poor syntactical skills or vocabulary of a student who uses Black English vernacular. As Geneva Smitherman noted, we have kids in the inner cities who are verbal geniuses, but we call them deficient in school and attempt to eradicate a part of their identity. Quoting Smitherman's words, April Baker Bell terms this form of cultural violence anti-Black linguistic racism and defines it as follows. Anti-Black linguistic racism refers to the linguistic violence, persecution, dehumanization, and marginalization that Black language speakers endure when using their language in schools and in everyday life. It includes teachers silencing, correcting, and policing students when they communicate in Black language. It is the belief that there is something inherently wrong with Black language, therefore it should be eradicated. It is requiring that Black students reject their language and culture to acquire white mainstream English, and it is also insisting that Black students code switch to avoid discrimination. Linguistic white supremacy and cultural erasure of other linguistic groups is no new thing, though the development of an opaque, theoretical, jargon-laden academic language occurred most emphatically in the 1970s, following a key moment of Black emancipation and self-assertion. We in Canada have to atone for this kind of damage to Black students, in addition to the cultural genocide perpetrated on Indigenous communities by the forcible suppression of 100 mother tongues and by the coerced re-education of Indigenous children in English. The point of returning to these histories is not merely to sigh in regret. It is to prevent ourselves from continuing to commit these forms of violence. But as long as we place standard language ideology at the heart of our educational efforts, we will not achieve the latter goal. Let me segue to a related subject, that of international students, most of whom in Canada are also racialized. At King's every year, we invite students from across the world to study here, ostensibly in celebration of the cultural enrichment they bring. But to draw on Ramon Martinez's observation about the labeling of multilingual students, we emphasize what they do not know instead of highlighting what they do know. Racialized international students are widely perceived as being in massive deficit, not only in terms of language, but also in terms of unfamiliarity with Western academic culture and lack of the kind of personhood that is recognizable to Western eyes. These perceived deficits lead inevitably to the alienating emphasis on surface correctness and the tendency to use writing instruction as an occasion for vigorous Canadian acculturation. Normalizing monolingualism and white middle-class Canadian monoculture, we fail to honor the linguistic strengths and range that the ability to code switch or to be active in 2 or more languages brings with it. In a time of global Englishes and variant upon variant of this language, our insistence on standard English, our assimilative moves in the name of academic standardization, and our penalizing of students who fall short on either count draw a clear racial line, dividing line on this campus. It is worth investigating why such racism, both specifically anti-Black and more wide spectrum, pervades writing studies and academic writing culture. I'm going to give you a small bit of history here. Variously called rhetoric, composition, communications studies, and writing studies, writing as a university discipline has, since its inception in the second half of the 19th century, been complicit with the creation and preservation of linguistic and social hierarchies. In the North American context, scholars like Richard Oman, Sharon Crowley, and Lynn Bloom have discussed the involvement of composition in the cultural projects of nationalism and middle-class formation. The disciplinary consolidation of writing studies, Oman notes, was as the crucible in which young, upwardly mobile white men were refined into effective communicators as they enrolled in top brand universities in preparation for political office or for professional, managerial, and administrative success in the burgeoning world of manufacturing in the 1920s and 30s. Bloom enumerates the virtues that freshman composition inculcates: critical thinking, responsibility, job readiness, individualism, decorum, efficiency, order, cleanliness, punctuality, and delayed gratification. In brief, good academic and national citizenship as defined by a middle class capitalizing on its strengths and its culture. She notes that these quote-unquote Franklinesque virtues have remained normative and dominant in writing courses from the late 19th century to the present. As I quote Bloom's list of virtues, I imagine you're thinking, but what is wrong with these qualities? Are they not precisely the ones we would want all students to develop? This response begs a couple of questions that touch upon class, disability, and race-based exclusions. First, many of these qualities are implicitly already identified with white able-bodied embodiment and white habitus. For example, linguistic decorum in the white academic setting, by definition, excludes Black vernacular vocabulary, with the latter being always marked as slang, the patois of the street, rather than the formal language of the classroom. There is no curiosity about how Black language became street and white language became academic. It is just unquestionably so in the eyes of educators who choose not to see how language intersects with oppression. Second, these expectations also enshrine white values and culture. For example, to risk a gross generalization, many racialized groups tend to value collaborativeness, collectivism, or relationship building over self-reliance and individualism. And students from such academic writing cultures must either assimilate or be marked as lacking critical thinking abilities, independent research skills, and full personhood. So deeply do people internalize the idea of some universal standard of good writing that when casual acquaintances discover that I teach writing, they immediately feel they have to apologize for the poor grammar in the last email they sent me. Writing instructors, themselves devalued, kept in eternal sessional bondage, and let in on sufferance by the back door, continue to be relentless gatekeepers, compulsively applying the red pen to pleas for the use of semicolons after conjunctive adverbs. This, despite the social turn in writing studies, which calls attention to the inextricable interweaving of acts of writing with social structures like class and race. Because the culture of academic writing, its obsession with seemingly apolitical rules and manners, tools and techniques, seems as self-evident and commonsensical as cutlery, we tend to forget that cutlery normalizing cultures have invariably seen people who carry their food to their mouth with their fingers as dirty and uncivilized. Such abstraction, such ignorance of the ways in which language is tied to embodiment and to a history of eugenics by other means, has its own effects in the lives of students. Not just Black or multilingual students, but all students who cannot produce discourse that stays within the narrow strip of the permissible, the correct, and the scholarly. Students whose writing habits do not conform to a myriad unspoken, racially inflected and ableist writing norms may not only fail their writing courses, but are likely to perform poorly in their writing tasks across the disciplines. This, in turn, has its affective consequences. Their confidence is undermined, they hate writing, they question their own fitness for academia, they face mental health struggles, and sometimes they drop out. Given that language practices and writing pedagogy are significant to the enactment of racism, what can we do? There are many possible responses, but I'm going to mention two. The first is an ameliorative response. It involves applying significant resources to building student academic literacies. It is interesting to note that even this rather pragmatic response flies in the face of the high literary elitism of writing studies in Canada, where, as Roger Graves notes, loyalty to the British belles lettres tradition, investment in high culture, philosophical idealism, and aversion to American pragmatism kept freshman composition from taking root in most universities until the 1970s. Northrop Frye, along with A.S.B. Woodhouse and Claude Bissell, dominated the English studies scene until the 1960s, and Jennifer Clary Lemon quotes Frye as follows: "An English teacher's ideal is the exact opposite of effective communication, or learning to become audible in the marketplace. What he has to teach is the verbal expression of truth, beauty, and wisdom. Thus spake Fry. It took several decades before the practical need for the ameliorative response was admitted. Currently, this response involves Year 1 writing instruction that bridges high school and university expectation levels, delivering writing workshops across the curriculum, setting up mentorships and writing centers, creating handouts and citation, and so on. These are efforts we already make at King's. The ameliorative response acknowledges the hegemony of whiteness in academia, which, as Coleman et al. Put it, only allows for small skirmishes within its fortress. For me, given how assimilative this approach still is, it is important to infuse it with what Paulo Freire called critical consciousness, especially when I'm teaching Black students or students of color. Critical consciousness goes beyond the kind of critical thinking that is taught in the typical writing class, beyond analyzing and evaluating texts, beyond even analyzing how texts embody power structures in the real world. While critical thinking is generally encouraged within carefully demarcated boundaries that rarely challenge social relations in the real world, critical consciousness might lead students to ask questions about the purpose and frameworks of critical thinking itself. Whom do institutions serve by building in students the capacity to analyze, categorize, and evaluate information? To what ends is critical thinking applied? Who has full access and who is marked as having deficits? Suresh Kanagaraja notes that critical writing can bring into being new orientations to the self and the world when it mobilizes what he calls difference as resource. In that most multilingual students are also bi or multicultural, the capacity for a double consciousness, one that can be at once immersed in and outside linguistic and cultural practices in the host setting, can be a valuable intellectual advantage that they have over their monocultural classmates. Kanagaraja notes that when the student's background is mobilized as a pedagogic resource, it can enable the values of multicultural students to function as a source of strength in their writing experience in English and help transfer many skills from the traditions of vernacular communication they come from. Critical consciousness would be reflected in students' awareness of how they themselves stand in relation to pedagogic and institutional power structures, ultimately supporting the choices that will permit their remaking of the relationship between themselves and the world. So much for the first solution. My second response to the question of linguistic justice is much more radical and would demand considerable effort. William Labov, researching Black English vernacular in the 70s, expresses the sociolinguist's exasperation at the ignorance reflected in language teaching by white instructors in classrooms that include Black children. I'm quoting him here. The teacher has no systematic knowledge of the non-standard forms which oppose and contradict standard English. Some teachers are reluctant to believe that there are systematic principles in non-standard English which differ from those of standard English. They look upon every deviation from schoolroom English as inherently evil, and they attribute these mistakes to laziness, sloppiness, or the child's natural disposition to be wrong. If it is valid that educators should not be judging student performance from a position of ignorance, they should really get over this inability to see pattern and creativity in non-standard language and give serious consideration to the possibility that a variety of Englishes can still communicate effectively in the academic context. Educators represent the institution and can either empower or stifle. Since good intentions do not dissolve colonial thinking or usher in linguistic justice all by themselves, and since professional development skill and drill workshops do not necessarily result in a more progressive pedagogy, perhaps accepting the value of humility can be a temporary solution. As Freire writes, I quote, "Dialogue cannot exist without humility. Dialogue as the encounter of men addressed to the common task of learning and acting is broken if the parties or one of them lack humility. How can I dialogue if I always project ignorance onto others and never perceive my own?" Going back to the point I began with, the key to playing the role of educator in an empowering way is to admit ignorance, to learn more, and to keep learning. This humility and openness would in fact benefit both students and instructors as it transforms in university culture. As Chita Tegmark et al. Observe, if both the increasingly global society made possible by modern technology and the culturally diverse societies in which we live are considered, success in the 21st century requires individuals to incorporate more than a single culture's system of thought. Culturally informed learning means more than just learning new information about another culture. It also means learning how to perceive, understand, express, and engage with myriad forms of information seamlessly. Thank you very much.
So at this time, if there are any questions via Zoom, we can take them, and I will relay them to either Dr. Broad or Dr. Natrajan. Dr. Broad, I have one quickly. In one of the photographs during your lecture, there was a grave of an individual from the Chinese Labor Corps, and it was dated 1919. Mm-hmm. How does the War Graves Commission determine where to put someone who doesn't necessarily pass away within the confines of the dates traditionally accepted as those within the First World War, for example?
One of the consequences of war is that people don't all die at once. People died of their wounds in the years that followed the war. People died of illness that spread, particularly the influenza epidemic in 1919, for example, that spread through military camps. And then as demobilized soldiers returned home, the disease returned with them back home. So the War Graves Commission established a date in 1921. That was the cutoff date for the First World War, and for the Second World War, it was 1947. And so people who died within that particular time period received a war grave. And the soldier in question, I don't know his precise history off of memory, but probably died of illness or wounds in 1919. And because he died in France, presumably at a military hospital, was buried there. That for many people in the United Kingdom, they accepted that pain of separation. It was also a relatively short distance for them to travel. For people in more remote regions of the British Empire and then Commonwealth, the idea that the dead wouldn't be repatriated was much more painful and much more contested.
Are there any other questions for our lecturers today? I have one. Where does the dialogue, Dr. Natrajan, where does the dialogue in dialects in Dickens and Twain fall in this contemporary affirmation of varied modes of language?
Thanks for that interesting question. On the whole, I think with Victorian novels and with novels that are generally authored by white authors, there has always been space for appreciating the use of dialect. So Dickens is somewhat caricatured local variants of English, and sometimes his individuated dialect variants are much appreciated and have been commented upon extensively by literary critics.
The next question is, excellent presentations, Dr. Natrajan. I am hopeful for a rethinking of how to train English teachers because of your words. How do you suggest English department heads go about this?
That's a very large question at a moment when I think we just need to start by reflecting that such a thing happens at all, that perhaps the way in which we conduct our pedagogy and the way we create our curricula exclude people. So the more we think about how that happens, the more we would be able to generate ideas about how to prevent it from happening. One obvious way would be to include writers in the curriculum who come from across the cultural spectrum, and especially Black and Indigenous writers. But it also is important to teach those texts well and to use pedagogic frameworks that don't end up exoticizing them or isolating them as, sort of token texts in the syllabus, but end up incorporating the wisdom that they offer about human equality.
There are a couple of comments about the excellent talks. Thank you. A couple of people saying that they wish they could applaud you live. That's nice. Are there any other questions? I have one here in person. One moment, please. Oh, never mind. Pardon me. We've got some applause from the few individuals in the room here. Any other questions before we move on? Seeing none.
Thank you very much, Dr. Broad and Dr. Natarajan. Thank you for your wisdom and sharing with us today. Gave us a lot to think about. Thank you to everyone who's watching from home today and listening from home. Congratulations again to our Student Award recipients. This officially concludes our 2020 King's University College Student Award Ceremony and Christopher Perrin Beatty Lecture. Thanks once again and have a wonderful afternoon.